if anyone has a problem, just please so. And if not, I would like to give the floor to Professor Kenna.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And lovely to see you all. So many old friends and new here. I can see all your names here on my screen. Lovely to see you all from all over the world. Let me just check a few things first. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me, Stefan? Is it good? Is it good quality? It's clear?
Yes, it's good quality.
And the second thing is, please ignore the background. I'm in my attic where I spent most of my time since last March. And of course, we have to cover up certain things, but the European flag comes in very handy sometimes when you want to cover up big piles of rubbish and corners and openings that you don't want people to see. So that's why I'm showing the European flag rather than any great propaganda mission. Okay, so I'm going to go through quite a lot of slides today. I'm putting a lot of color in because I realize it's Friday afternoon. It's late on Friday afternoon, and for some of us, it's the second week back in college, and we're, how would you say, our concentration is not as good as it was on the 6th of September. So I have a lot of color, but please don't let that, if you like, dazzle you in any way, because the message behind it is very clear and hopefully simple, because one of the things we're accused of when we talk about housing rights is making the thing so damn complicated that only lawyers can join the conversation. And that shouldn't be, but fortunately it is. So where I'm coming from, I did a PhD on the right to housing finished in 2002. I was actually at the United Nations in 2001, just 3 months before the 9/11. For a meeting of Habitat, I think it was called, UN Habitat or UN Housing. And I managed to collect all the reports from something like 140 countries and buy 2 extra suitcases and bring them all back. That time everything was in print. And I read them all as part of my PhD. And they were quite enlightening, actually, about the state of the right to housing around the world in 2001. Because they're now all online, and you can read them, and you can do a PhD without ever going near the UN. So I'm coming from that perspective. I've probably read, maybe I should say, 700 or 800 articles on the right to housing, probably about 100 books on the right to housing, covering all angles, including, of course, law, but politics, sociology, planning, economics, public administration, geography, development, and of course the whole business of making money, which is what housing is mostly about, including property, which I teach, property law. So there's a lot of other areas that come into this space that we have to be aware of, and that's probably the theme of today's talk, is that the other areas that we come across here often have more impact on housing than housing rights. And that's my conclusion that I've come to after all these years. And I'm hoping to explain that to you now a little bit. So let's go to the first slide then, which is called The Right to Housing. For short, I'm calling it RTH. And of course, there's a lot of literature on this. And I'm not going to recite all of the literature on the right to housing, or what it means, or where you can find it. If you go into the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing website, you'll find all these reports. Actually, if you even just Google the right to housing now, you'll find so many reports on it and so many websites. So there isn't really any point in me going through all that. But just to pick out a few things. Homelessness, evictions, which of course is what this project is about, poor housing, unaffordable rents, are all key right to housing issues, as well as discrimination. And globally, we get these figures from the UN. About 1.8 billion people are homeless or living in inadequate housing. This is seen as a violation of the right to housing, especially the right to human dignity. But parallel to that, we find in the last 10, 15 years, this massive reordering of cities, reordering of housing, unaffordable housing in all our main cities around the world, to rent or buy. And this is the reality today. The question that's sometimes presented to me is, have these things got anything to do with the right to housing, or does the right to housing have anything to offer these things? Are we going to house 1.8 billion people by giving them copies of the right to housing? I don't think so. Are we going to reorder our cities and regulate global finance by giving them copies of the International Covenant on the Right to Housing? I don't think so. So that leaves us with a couple of other big questions. So what do we do, and how do we develop the right to housing? So we go to the next slide, and this is a perennial discussion goes on between human rights lawyers. I'm sure you know about it. This question of, are we talking about the right to housing or housing rights? And so much ink has been used on this that it probably deserves, to be counted as one of the big debates of our time. And basically, the view is that the right to housing is this international human rights norm, sometimes constitutional, which kind of transcends everything else. It almost has this supernatural quality. Whereas housing rights are something we find in domestic law, rules, regulations, procedures, rent controls, all these kind of what you'd call boring things, boring housing things. And there seems to be two parallel thoughts. Now, Jessie Holman raises this in her book in great detail, but I'm hoping to explain as we go on. These are not necessarily incompatible, and we cannot really afford to be treating these things separately. But it does come to the core question: can we have this rights-based global minimum of social rights or housing rights, which will progressively improve as time goes on? And what would it look like, and how would it work? Is it going to be linear? Is it going to stop and start? Is it going to regress? What's going to drive it? Is it going to be human rights lawyers? Are they going to drive it? Are these areas really just for specialists who understand human rights? So they're questions that are very pertinent questions in this whole debate, because we're already finding that other writers are raising doubts about this model. For instance, Samuel Moyne says that our history of socioeconomic rights has proven not to be very successful. And he compares equality, the massive disparities in equality that have developed over the last 30 years, and the human rights obsession, he says, with this minimum standard. He doesn't mention progressive realization, which surprises me. But his criticisms are that human rights and socioeconomic rights are really not enough to deliver what we want. There's also criticism after the global financial crisis, when housing was seen to contribute to the almost collapse of the global financial system, collapse of the economies of many countries, including Ireland and Spain. And then after that, a major supervisory governance system was established globally to ensure that this never happened again, to regulate mortgage lending, to supervise banks. Nowhere in any of this did we see any reference to human rights or housing rights. And so we have people like Aoife Nolan asking the question, are these international human rights fit for purpose anymore if they're not if it's not possible to integrate them into these new developments? Let's go to the next slide then. And here's my favorite slide, because what I want to show you here is that when we're talking about housing rights, we really are talking about these delicate flowers. And the area of housing is inhabited by a great many beasts. And we've seen this over and over again. We have major financial corporations. We have major development corporations. We have major property owning companies. We have big law firms who are going to fight cases on any small interference with property rights. We have big lobbyists who lobby governments to promote their interests. And down here in the bottom corner, we have these lovely housing rights. Now, that's not to say they're not going to be important. Of course they are. But we just have to recognize that this field is pretty serious, and we're not the biggest players. In fact, we're probably, those of us who advocate for housing rights, fairly small players in this whole field. And the most we can do is really influence key changes here and there until we can get the principles accepted. So let's go to the next slide then. And it's about human rights, really, and it's about housing rights. And we also have to remember from the literature that these things didn't just come about from certain judges and legal academics sitting down one day and say, you know, it would be a great idea if we introduced housing rights. They actually came about, or human rights, they came about through major struggles and conflicts. In housing, for instance, if you think of the 19th century, if you think of the Grenfell Tower disaster in England, if you think of having 10 of those a year in our developing cities in the 19th century, and then think of what reaction people would have. They would want rules, they would want controls. And it's out of those kind of situations that these housing rights and human rights developed. And the question is, are they enough? And the other question is, can we use them? Can we integrate them into the complexity of modern housing systems? And one of the examples I often give of how you can really shoot yourself in the foot, if you like, was the subprime lending system. Some of it was justified on the basis of discrimination that already existed in the US. So this lending was opened up to all minority groups who wouldn't normally be eligible for mortgage lending. And as you know, the subprime crisis, subprime lending developed justified on the basis of non-discrimination and equality. And what was the result? With the crash, it wiped out most of the limited wealth which had been created in the previous 20 years by Hispanic and African American communities. So we have to be careful sometimes. What seems to be an obvious solution, unless we can see the consequences in the system, can actually turn out to be the opposite. So let's go to the next slide and have a little bit of context. So housing rights, or perhaps the right to housing, developed in most industrial societies, urbanized societies, as a result of disasters, plagues, epidemics, public health measures. Also, of course, private markets. And the rule on private markets is a very simple rule. Those who have money, land, and wealth can enjoy good housing. Those who don't will live in slums. And that rule hasn't really changed in the last 200 years. You just have to look around the world and see that. There's another issue, though, and that is if we want to provide people with good quality housing, it costs quite a bit of money. The OECD produces reports all the time on how many years of income does it take to develop a house in each country. And you can get that chart. Actually, it's my next slide, actually. And, you know, let's say 10 years of income. So there's only really two choices here. Either the state provides that, or the person borrows for 20 or 30 years on a mortgage. There's really only two choices, two ways of doing this. Socialist systems, post-war welfare state systems, communist systems directly provided housing and excluded the market. The United States, Britain, as well as providing housing, and lots of other countries, provided guaranteed mortgages and tax relief on mortgages to generally the favored in-group white working class people who were in the politically powerful. So let's go to the next slide. And so there you can see the OECD 2021. They compare how many years of income does it cost for the average house, 100 square meters dwelling. It's big-ish for some countries, but small for Ireland, very small. So, you know, it's around 10 years, some places a little bit more. Let's go to the next slide. All this, of course, was great because states could provide funding in the post-war Keynesian economics from the 1930s in the US and even more after the 1950s, until we got to the 1980s and 90s, when the cost of housing, the price of housing, and the level that states could spend began to get tighter. And so there was also lots of thinking that we'd solved the housing problem in a lot of countries. We had built so many houses, happened in Ireland as well. We didn't really need to go on building more houses, that we'd really solved it. And we could now really hand over to the market, and the market would provide for those who were entering the system by low mortgages, low interest rate mortgages, but that the state would withdraw. And this was global, actually. It was a global development, affected every country in the world. It was typified really in the World Bank report on housing 1993 when they said In terms of international investment, it's not really a good idea to be building houses. It doesn't produce enough housing. We need to step back from that. We need to get the housing markets to work. And so there was a whole literature on creating land registration systems, how to support mortgages, securitization, to get markets to work. And this privatization, this went with a privatization of social housing, probably led from England and Wales, but generally everywhere. And then we saw from the early 90s Russian, Soviet Union housing being privatized, Central and Eastern Europe, and of course in the 90s China. So this is a global development. It coincided, of course, also with this rise in the financialization of housing, where housing finance became integrated in these what's called global circuits of capital. So it became part of the global investment arrangements. And of course, any changes in interest rates affected everybody. And so that's how it went. And we had really housing bubbles and bubbles. We know the United States, but mostly in the English-speaking world. Actually, we had these housing bubbles in 2000, followed by the crash. And the crash, of course, affected every country, not just the English-speaking economies. And, of course, almost destroyed the global financial system. So we had the Financial Stability Board. We had meetings of the world leaders, or emergency meetings to deal with this, almost like, apocalypse had happened. And so measures were introduced to make sure this would never happen again, including tighter regulation on banks around the world, very stricter controls on the level of mortgage lending by banks, particularly who could borrow. All of this, as I say, was oblivious to the right to housing movement. Nobody asked, is there anything here on human rights? It wasn't even a factor. In any of the documents, you won't find any mention of the right to housing. Let's go to the next slide. And so that trajectory continues. And I have two slides here, this one and the next one, to show you probably what we'd say was the glory days, the great days when there was lots of social and public housing, where people could be allocated housing based on their needs, sometimes called universalist, sometimes called workers' housing, social rights, a big stock of public or social housing. But always, in every country we also had private housing, which was seen as access through the market, through inheritance or sales from government, usually alongside subsidized mortgages and tax relief. So there was a lot of state involvement. It's not as if it was almost like private versus public. The state was heavily involved in both. Access. The key question on the right to housing is access. How do we arrange access? So in the private, of course, very much based on income. Although we do find discrimination, particularly if you want to see The Color of Law is a very good book to read on the US, how Black African Americans were denied mortgages historically, which put them in a completely different position to others. Other groups were discriminated against as well, but access is generally based on income. And of course, for the social and public housing, access is based very much on citizenship rights or rights. Obviously, discrimination existed in favor and against some groups, but it's not the predominant issue for the right to housing. Now let's go to the next slide and see what happens when we reduce that. So when we reduce or residualize that social housing, all of a sudden we see that the dynamics have changed completely. And we still have access to the private market with subsidized mortgages, tax relief, political support for home ownership, lots of subsidies. We've a hugely subsidized housing system in Ireland and lots of countries. It's hidden through the tax system, through largesse of the state, etc. But then when we look at what happens when we residualize our public housing, now we find access is rationed because we have a limited number. So it's rationed. We then find we have priority groups. We find this jostling for position of who is the priority group. We find judicial reviews on fairness. The question of discrimination becomes big, center stage. Is one group discriminated against over another group? And so we have lots and lots of cases on that, particularly around homelessness. We also revert back to questions of human dignity. We really are talking about allocating housing on the basis of human dignity now. So we're going to a very low base of citizenship rights. And in this context, the right to housing is regularly invoked, and lots written about this. So let's go to the next slide then. So parallel, let me say, while all this is happening, let me just give you a quick overview on the right to housing. As you know, it's been around a long time. It's been in constitutions and national laws for a long time, particularly in Europe. But at the international level, we find it first in the Universal Declaration, 1948. Housing is part, or as part, of an adequate standard of living. And that's very important. It's not separate. It's part of an adequate standard of living. Again, in 1966, the International Covenant. But this is a little bit stronger, and this says the countries of the world will take steps to realize this right. So you could say the 1948 was a declaration. The 1966 was actually a call to action. And then various general comments after that sort of spelt it out by the UN Committee with minimum core obligations for all states, a minimum in a whole range of rights, and progressive realization. And so then we had further general comments. We have regular monitoring and reports. We now have an optional protocol where you can complain directly to the UN Committee. And then we see these rights developed in other charters around the world, Africa, the European Charter 1961, 1996 European Social Charter. We also see some of these civil and political rights on the European Convention actually moving into the area of home, particularly around this privacy, family life and home, and more recently around this question of interference with home and the proportionality test. We also see that about 40% of the world's constitutions have a mention of housing rights, usually associated with something else, like indigenous people, land, privacy, particular groups. Rarely, if any, does it stand on its own, except perhaps the South African Constitution, which says people will have a right to have access to adequate housing. So it's not a right to adequate housing, it's a right to have access to adequate housing. And that fundamental couple of words, of course, as you know, has had enormous impact in the legal development there. In Europe, we're finding the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is part of European treaty law since 2009, actually invokes a lot of these international instruments, and I'll talk about that later. Let's go to the next slide. So as I say, it's a Friday evening, and these are very complicated words, so I want to make a little simple chart. So the minimum core obligations and no discrimination, that's what states accept as soon as they sign, which of course practically every country has signed except, as you know, the United States. And then there is progressive realization as resources permit to the maximum of resources. There's a big debate about whether regression is actually allowed at times of recession. And there is potential, but it cannot be justified and it cannot affect the most vulnerable. So let's go to the next slide, which is a little bit about the minimum core obligations. And these are widely used in the UN reporting system. In fact, every country addresses this question in their reports to the UN every few years. It's more than shelter. It actually really reflects the minimum obligations, which are the normative standards. What are the normative standards? So if you're introducing a right to shelter, for instance, but in fact, nobody really lives in shelters anymore, that's not the normative standard. So we would have that in Ireland. A normative standard would be mostly housing, rarely emergency housing. But these obligations, of course, require public expenditure, regulation of the economy and land markets, infrastructure, redistribution, and lots of things. So although it might look very simple, to meet the minimum core obligation requires governments to take a lot of measures to achieve that. And so that normative standard becomes very, very movable because there's constant pressure for more and more resources, regulation, redistribution to meet this normative standard. And that's really what the battle is around the right to housing, actually. it's very useful because it puts the burden of proof on the state rather than the person. In terms of the normative standard, I find an interesting one in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, Article 34.3, which is not, of course, you cannot directly use it in the courts, but it informs the social inclusion policies of the Union. And it refers to a decent existence for all those who lack sufficient resources. Now, I would say that's very much higher standard than the UN standard. And we should be careful that we don't sort of adopt UN standards, which are set at a level that every country can meet them. Let's go to the next slide then. And so we have this matrix of housing rights, minimum core obligations, government obligations, progressive realization, and then you have all those elements of General Common 4 and General Common 7, which I'm sure you're all familiar. I won't go into those. Let's go to the next slide to look at the machinery of this international law, public international law approach. And it's called, well, I took this word from my PhD supervisor, Gerard Quinn, years ago, who's now the UN Special Rapporteur for Disability. He called it the transmission belt, which is like a car engine or bicycle or a motorbike or whatever. It's a chain. And so it starts with the international treaty, which is adopted by the state, which then agrees to take steps on the basis of minimum core obligations, progressive realization, or in case, for instance, of the European Convention, make sure that these rights are practical and effective rather than theoretical. And we find in the European Social Charter to secure to everyone within their jurisdiction these rights and freedoms. So there's all different wordings for that. So these are adopted, and then the plan is that this is integrated into the domestic laws, constitutions, policies, spending, whatever. Sometimes there's a mechanism for courts to use these at the national level, but that's not the primary approach. The primary approach is then states will make reports, or people or NGOs can make complaints or take cases to the monitoring, the adjudicating body or the international court, who will then pass on its decision or recommendation or finding to the state, which will implement it in its domestic policy. This is the model. This is a UN model, the international model, the international human rights model, really. And what I'm trying to show here is that there's no real separation between the international and the national. They're all part of the same system. Let's go to the next one. And a little bit of advertising here. Fianza in Housing Rights Watch, which I'm involved in, has just launched their new booklet on their website, Binding Obligations Relating to Housing from European and International Case Law. And you can read all of the international human rights in that. Next one. So it comes to the question then of how do we enforce them? As some people say, there's really no right without a remedy. Well, the UN and the international system, they don't send in an army to say you have to build houses. Yes, there is international aid organized by the UN and Red Cross and all the various UN agencies at times of crisis. Yes, politically and institutionally, all member states address the UN narrative and make reports as they're required, practically all. Whether they implement the recommendations and conclusions, of course, it's a mixed bag, and there's been lots and lots of research done on that, PhDs and books comparing. NGOs have a big role, the media have a big role, opposition parties have a big role, and so there's a lot of naming and shaming goes on as part of the system. But the question is, can we bring this into courts? And so Katie Boyle's new book, she points out using courts to enforce these outcomes is complex and difficult, because you have these questions of how clear is the standard, who can use this right, does it grant personal rights? And there are lots of complicated issues. The model is, we have rights holders and duty bearers, which is the state. It should be straightforward. We have rights holders and duty bearers, except, of course, it's not that straightforward. When it comes to housing, the state is really just one of many players in a big system. And so market players, certain private players, the state can intervene through different forms of regulation, planning, building standards, mortgage market regulation, housing standards, direct provision, consumer protection, big one, now in Ireland. But these issues of public and private law are quite complex. Sometimes we find in the human rights literature references to non-state actors, which I don't find that very a good description, really, of these other parties who are, in fact, the most powerful actors in the whole process in most cases. And we can't really call them actors. They're more than actors. It's not really a theater. It's much more power laden. There is also the question of the separation of powers. Can judges order governments to build houses? And nowhere in the world have judges told governments to build houses. And as we know from all the South African cases, major disappointment among many human rights lawyers that this didn't happen. Once it's in the Constitution, it should have happened, as they say. Well, it didn't. So there's a lot of writing, and one of the best analysis I find is Jeff King, Judging Social Rights, where he points out unless the institutional arrangements are in place, then claiming violations of housing rights is not really going to change much. Courts will not create housing systems. These violations approaches work best where we already have institutional provision and systems in place and laws. Then judges are able to act to say there's a breach of obligation. Let's go to the next slide. And this is one I just stuck in later there just this morning because I know this is the EVICT project, and I couldn't resist because I did with a good number of you, project for the European Commission in 2016 on looking at evictions in the whole of Europe, actually, in the 28 countries. And we tried to create a little matrix, a little chart of what's the relationship between homelessness and evictions. And we found evictions are a long process. Most homelessness occurs from the beginning, but actually most homelessness comes from not from owner occupation, private renting, or social renting, but from people in unauthorized and informal occupancy arrangements. And so that's also to say that the institutional structures have a huge role to play. That's the only lesson from that. Let me go to the next slide. And I want to give you another institution that we have to think about, and that is the dominant one in political, economic, and media discourse. And that is what I call the boom-bust housing market model. And I've taken this chart from the European Systemic Risk Board, which is one of these bodies set up after the global financial crash, to be the eyes and ears of the European Central Bank, to basically go around, check out what's happening in every country, to see are they creating a credit-induced housing bubble, which is going to bankrupt the euro again. So they do huge amounts of research, and they produce this lovely chart, which I couldn't resist using. And they said, oh, all our housing systems are in this cycle. So they're in expansion, which is firmly expanding or mature, which is going to be followed by a downturn. And that's going to be followed by a recession, which is going to be followed by a recovery. And so they've actually set out what's going to happen in each one of these stages. Now, this is not something to be taken lightly. This is the eyes and ears of the European Central Bank, who is the most powerful institution probably in the European Union. And this is the model they're using to look at housing systems. And I think that's quite significant to myself, where it talks about decreasing vacancy rates. We have all sorts of things like high vacancy rates in the bottom corner here, which means there's going to be a lot of empty properties. So it's really revealing when you look at these things. And I did a project, which if you want to look up, called This Time It Will Be Different, looking at how we'd integrate housing rights into the work of the ESRB and the ECB. But there it is, there's a right to housing over in the side, looking in. And that's the way I kind of tried to portray this, sort of looking in. Let's go to the next one. And this is another one that's used by the World Bank, although they've moved on a bit from it now, but this was the global model for looking at housing systems. 5 essential elements: registration of property rights, housing finance, mortgages, an infrastructure system, water, sewage, land, power, regulation of building planning, all of that. And then another part which was essential which is the housing subsidies and social housing side of it, for people who couldn't access the market. Otherwise, the market wouldn't operate, because I think they discovered in Nigeria, when the mortgage market was being developed, people couldn't access mortgages. They squatted the properties, and so the market couldn't work. So they decided that there is a need for subsidized or social housing in all the systems. So that's not anything particularly radical. Let's go to the next slide. What I have found, though, is that when we look at international human rights and housing rights, we tend to focus on property rights, surprisingly. There's a huge literature on property as a human right, enormous literature. And although it's not in all the international instruments, it's in some of them, it's in the Universal Declaration, but not in the International Covenant. It is, of course, in the European Convention. It's not in a lot of global constitutions like Australia, Canada, or the US, surprisingly, but it is in lots of other ones. But it's the main argument in terms of human rights and housing, actually. The vast majority of cases at the European Court of Human Rights are about property appropriation and loss of property and human rights. That's the vast majority of cases. On the other side, we see a lot of cases around access to social housing or subsidized housing on poverty, slum clearance, poverty, basic standards. We don't see much interaction at all on the, for instance, the regulatory standards regime of building standards, planning, zoning. We don't see much human rights engagement at all. Hardly any on the residential infrastructure, except sort of very vague things like there should be a right to water, there should be a right to, but there's no engagement in how exactly is that met. And there's really no engagement at all in the global or national or regional housing finance regimes from international housing and human rights advocacy. How am I doing on time here? Let me see, 20 more minutes, okay. So let's go to the next slide. And so I'm taking that previous chart there, which is the general global view, except that I'm saying this is not true in Europe. This is actually not true in Europe. We've got a whole lot of intervention in Europe on the EU economic governance side. For instance, single supervisory mechanism regulates mortgage lending across the Eurozone very strictly. Mortgage interest rates are set at the European level. We have the fiscal compact, where government spending has to be agreed by the European Commission. That's quite significant, very much monitored. Consumer rights. We have the European semester, the coordination of economic activity across the European Union. We have the semester reports pointing to governments how they need to manage their housing systems. Do they need to invest in social and affordable housing? This is very powerful stuff. We have these, what's called the macroeconomic imbalance procedures, where they monitor house prices, detailed monitoring of house prices in every country, and a database and a chart as an indicator of macroeconomic instability. And that's a hugely powerful driver of the action of the European institutions. We have anti-money laundering directives, very powerfully enforced, and I think likely to become much more significant in the debate. We have the European Pillar of Social Rights, and of course we have the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which informs all of European policy. Let's go to the next chart and just have a look at that. And in there, we find quite a few of these international rights are adopted in EU law, actually. The Charter, as you know, is part of treaty law. So it has a status higher than national constitutions or national laws, or even European law. It's a treaty, it has treaty law. It doesn't give a standalone right to housing, but really very few instruments do, actually, really. But it does have to be integrated into the whole governance arrangements of the European Union or member states when they implement EU law. So what do we find in it? Well, we find Article 8, respect for home, privacy and family life, of course. We find the rights of the child, the housing relevant. We find the rights of persons with disabilities. We find the European Social Charter. We find the Article 16 is in there, the one that's really created the obligations for social housing. We find this 34.3, which is, of course, limited that it's only in the social inclusion policies, but it has quite interesting wording to ensure a decent existence for all those who lack sufficient resources in the European Union. We also find services of general economic interest have to be recognised in European governance. These are really approved housing, social housing, public services have to be recognised in European governance. Consumer protection, and also, of course, an obligation to maintain existing human rights levels. So this is not going to in any way diminish existing rights. Let's go to the next few. So who has to comply with this? Well, it's very simple, really. It's all of the European bodies, including ECB, Commission, and it's also the member states when they're implementing EU law. Now, there's been a veritable forest of paper used to try and figure out when are states implementing or not implementing EU law. And I'm not going to add to that massive amount of discussion and debate, except to say, whenever EU law is being implemented, the Charter applies. And what does that obligation mean? It means that the member states or the European institutions must respect the rights, observe the principles, and promote the application of the Charter. And that's actually a positive obligation, to promote the application. That's not a bystander. That's not something that says, oh, of course, we acknowledge the Charter. No, it's not acknowledge. It's promote the application of the Charter. And I think that's quite significant. That's stronger than we get in very many human rights instruments. Let's go to the next one.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, Professor Kenna, your very interesting presentation, but I would like to ask you to come to some sort of rounding, so we have some time for questions.
Okay, I will. Okay, let me go then.
Thank you very much.
Go to the next slide. And so I created this little chart to sort of highlight the institutional issues in housing, which I see as three levels. They're at the macro level. So we have lots of international human rights at the macro level. At the institutional or the middle level, very little engagement. At the micro personal level, lots of engagement in human rights. Let's go to the next one. And that's just for your easy on your eyes. Okay, next one. And so, all right. So when we say all that, so you might say, well, what's the benefit of housing rights, the right to housing? Is it just pointless then? No, it's not. I'm still saying that it's hugely valuable because it creates a number of things, a common language around the world to deal with housing deprivation, housing need, and people's rights. There's a common language globally, hugely powerful. Use of it, it's very much an empowerment tool. People can use it for solidarity, etc. Except academically, it's been declared, defined, probed, and examined and written about, but has had very little impact because it doesn't really address how housing systems operate. In fact, what we need to recognize is that housing rights advocates have many common objectives with regulators and legislators in this field. We can develop that through the European governance frameworks by using the Charter. But what I'm also saying is that these regional and national, what's called housing rights, can actually do the heavy lifting for the international system. So let's go to the last slide then. And so I've leaving you with a question or a dilemma. And it's this. Should we just deal with housing rights as a sort of social welfare approach in a situation of very limited and rationed public housing provision? Which are a little bit different to charity because they're based on rights, but not that different. It's the same model, really, almost the same model. Or do we use this as a means of evaluating and directing national and international regulation of all the elements of the housing system to ensure what we all have accepted now is this enjoyment of adequate, secure and affordable housing for all. And that's one of the things that the right to housing does. It gives us this standard we can use to evaluate all of these policies and procedures, which is global and well developed and, of course, legitimate. And I stop.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Kenna. I think you provided us with a very interesting history of the development of housing rights, as well as a great overview of the housing rights and the right to housing. And I also believe you mentioned Dr. Jesse Holman, who also contributed much to the conceptualization and understanding of the right to housing.
Yes.
And what's really great is that Dr. Holman will be our guest speaker on the 18th of November, so in 2 months' time. So I'm looking forward to her presentation as well. So we have, well, about 13 minutes for questions or discussion. So if there are any questions, you can use raise hand button, or you could just wave your arms and I'll try to see you. Are there any questions? Yeah, I see Irina.
Hi Stefan. Hi Michelle. Hi Padraic.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Hi.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy I could connect. Today is a holiday in Chile, so we don't have daycare. But I'm very happy I managed. Because as always, I really find always inspiring to listen to you, Padraic, and I get so many ideas and I want to do everything. Maybe I'm not the only one. But while you were talking, I was actually thinking of the same question that you asked in the very end. So I'm not sure if I really have a question, or my question goes to, what do you think of these two questions that you, like, what is the question that we should answer of these two? Because every time I'm thinking about housing, there's so many different regulatory levels, so many different rights, right to property. There's corporate law, there's tax law, there's urban law, there is administrative law, private law. Like everything is so complex and so functionally differentiated in a way that to me, this sounds like a very, not just complex system, but every complex system is very expensive in many ways, not just in money, but also in thought that has to go into all of us, using our working time to like try to understand this and grasp it and think about what is the best way to address all the problems that there are. So what if we go away from this weird functional differentiation and focus on what the right to housing is actually about, which is access to adequate housing? It's actually quite simple. And this is a right that is invoked against states. So why don't we just go back to your number one in these two questions, that is public provision, and basta. We would all be out of a job. We could focus on something else. I mean, basically what I want to say is that, not that this would be the answer to everything, but complexity would be extremely removed, legal complexity, right? Because the one addressee of the rights, I hope I'm using that word now, right? The address is the state. And then legally, the whole issue is much easier than trying to understand property rights and all these kind of things that I think are just noise and deflecting attention from what the issue actually is. So it's a bit radical, maybe, but inspired by your talk and the last two questions that you posed. So suggestively, I am thinking number one is maybe better. What do you think?
Yes, number one, a social welfare approach. Yeah. Well, this is the big challenge, really. Do we just leave the whole regulatory system to itself? Do we say we're not going to get involved in this? And this is what's actually happened, in fact. So what I'm suggesting hasn't happened at all. The whole changes that have taken place since 2008, the right to housing is nowhere in any of this. Okay, China has introduced social housing policies, but it's because of an completely unaffordable market. But the question is, do we leave all of this to the market, to the private sector, and say, we don't care about any of this? I don't think so, because I think we've discovered through the business and human rights model that actually changes can be brought. Changes can be brought, for instance, to the supply chain, slavery, all of these things. When I was doing some research with the European institutions in the last couple of years, which you were involved in, Arina,
Hi, Padraic.
I discovered there was a real openness to saying, how do we use the Charter to improve our regulation on the right to housing? You know, and you know some of the people as well who work in the European Central Bank, they're open to these things. But the human rights, housing rights approach, probably because I think we are very legally inward looking, and we're all the time trying to define in more precise terms, what do we mean by a violation? What do we mean by discrimination? And it's almost become self-perpetuating, the whole, you know, I'm not going to call it the human rights industry at all, but it's almost become self-perpetuating and doesn't look outside itself at all. But the other point you make, the first, second slide, third slide, when we had a big stock of public and social housing, this issue was not the high-profile issue. And that's true, and that is absolutely true. But it's very difficult to go back to that. Part of the reason is because housing has become so expensive, but also because the players are so well connected in international investment. I mean, 50% of bank assets in Europe are tied up in housing and development land. And that is so huge that if you want to make any kind of changes, they are going to have a huge influence on how you do it. I agree with you, that is the solution, but I'm not sure how we get there.
Just a quick comment to this. Today I heard the news that yesterday in Berlin, the Senate bought back 15,000 flats from private housing providers that had, it's totally crazy, in the 90s bought all these flats from the city of Berlin. And now the city kind of realized, yeah, that's not working. We have too little housing that is affordable, spiraling out of control prices. We will have a referendum on expropriation of some of these providers, private providers. So I think politically the Senate was maybe trying to kind of preempt a bit the pro-expropriation vote, because it was kind of saying, no, look, we don't need to expropriate you. We can just buy them from you. But what I want to say is that this is a kind of a reversal of a politics that started 25 years ago and kicked off all the misery, right? So I'm not saying that it's easy to really substitute it again, but it seems to be sinking in that this is our way to go. Of course, it's politically difficult. There's a lot of path dependency, but just a comment that this just happened in Berlin. So it's interesting.
I mean, I think that's very interesting. You know, do they pay the full market price for these? Because then it's maybe, you know, whereas if they pay less than the market price, they will probably bring them to the European Court of Human Rights.
I think they paid market price. It was very, very expensive. I don't know, it was in billions.
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point. I mean, if you read Thomas Piketty's book, and he regards housing as a capital asset, which is remarkable. But anyway, his suggestion is that the real battle is around progressive taxation of property. And that if we're going to change our constitutions, we need to put in a provision that will not prevent progressive levels of taxation of property. And that is actually one of the most radical demands, not even coming from a human rights perspective at all, but would probably have the most impact in that situation. So if you have a progressive, more tax by more property, you can actually influence the system very powerfully. And of course, it doesn't interfere with human rights because taxation is one of the things that's allowed under the European Convention. So, I mean, there's lots of big companies in Ireland would love to sell their hugely expensive blocks to the state at full market value and get out of the whole business of managing housing before it becomes political. But I don't think we should pay them full market value.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yeah, I see Per Norberg.
No, not a question. I thought that the last discussion was very, very interesting. So if you want questions, leave it to others.
Okay, let's see if someone else has a question. I see Jane, I think. Yeah.
Yes. Hi. great to get a wonderful update from Padraic. Lovely. You always miss things. Now, I'm always been one for studying institutions, and I feel that housing rights have a really valuable function of gap filling in national institutions, because you should never make the assumption that the other country has all the same institutions. For instance, Spain didn't have a proper defensive mortgage. So they were very, very interested in promoting the right to housing in relation to protecting mortgage borrowers. Whereas we have mortgage protection, which is so old, everybody's forgotten it's there. It goes right back to the 16th century, you know. Similarly, France, or Napoleonic countries generally, a tenancy doesn't have sort of secure rights as a concept, whereas in sort of the US and parts of the US and Ireland and England, tenants have rights based in property. They might be rubbish as a contract, but they do have sort of some protection. So you can draw down the right to property to fill the gaps in your system, but first you have to know that the gaps are there, and that's the hard part. So what do you think of that approach, Padraic?
I think it's very important to do that, to look at the system in each country. And that's why the problem with the public international human rights is they're so broad brush that you need to actually look at each country. And that part of the problem is people cite international human rights. They're going to be applied differently in every country. Every country has a different housing system, different balance between property owners and non-property owners, different levels of financial securitization, different legal structures. The principles are very good. The right to adequate housing is very good. How you apply it, if you don't apply it by basic public provision, which is diminished, and talking to the public servants, they say, well, we've many other ways of doing this. We don't have to go out and build big blocks of housing. We can actually, integrate it into private housing. We can have sustainable communities. We need to integrate private and social and public housing anyway. We don't want to create segregated social housing. So I agree with you, Jane. I think there's a job to be done in every country, and it's different in every country. But some of the broad standards like progressive property taxation could probably be applied everywhere.
Good answer.
Thank you very much. I saw Michel raising his hand, and it's almost 5 o'clock. So if you have to leave, then feel free to do so. But if not, please just stay and enjoy the discussion. So Michel, please.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much, Padraic, for giving this great presentation. And it's so great to see that many faces. I think we have around 4 or 5 continents now live on the screen, so that's very great. And so, Padraic, I was puzzled by your final question. So, are housing rights a welfare approach, a social welfare approach, to argue for priority in rationed and severely limited public housing, or is it a tool to basically evaluate how countries are doing? But for me, that also depends on how you see yourself as a scholar, I would say. And I think that's also what's happening here in this housing law community. Some housing law scholars are actually quite more activist, I would say, that want to argue this normative approach that housing should be there for all and should, for example, house the poor. Whereas others would say, yeah, it's a tool to analyze housing systems and to maybe also critique them based on this objective standard, for example, laid down in Article 11, and then trying to explain why countries don't comply with it or do comply with it. So that's a different approach. Do you see the point? So I myself are more on the second side, I would say, although I agree with housing the poor, but I'm trying not to be a housing activist in my work, right? So to try to keep the normative aspect from the other more like objective, or I don't know whether it's objective or more like the testing, and then trying to explain why they don't comply or do comply. So what about you? So are you on the other side, or are you more on the testing side and trying to explain side?
Well, I'm posing this question, is it either or? And my experience has been that people are in one or the other of these. I've really hardly ever come across people who say, actually, it's both. You can't do one without the other. But then if you say it's both, and then you say, okay, so we're going to look at the second one, we're going to evaluate the housing policy. Okay, well then we need to become a bit more sophisticated. We cannot come up with stuff and say everyone should have a mortgage, because that's not realistic. And then they're going to end up in debt. But you could say something like banks must provide non-recourse mortgages and take the risk rather than putting the risk on the borrower, and that's already in the Mortgage Credit Directive of the European Union. So I suppose in a way what I'm saying is we need to work a bit harder in this field rather than just presenting these wonderful texts and kind of saying, well, access to housing for everyone should be a right. I don't think anybody would disagree with that in the world, actually. I've never met anybody who disagreed with that. Or housing should be a human right and it's based on human dignity. I've never met anybody who said that's not true. But I do hear it being used as a kind of theme for conferences, which I thought these things were settled 30 years ago, 50 years ago. But it seems they're not. But new people, of course, come in all the time and we have to re-go. But I just feel that, this call we're on here, running and hosting this, and, we're looking at it at a more complex level, okay, than sort of a general public television program. So this is why I'm saying these two things, to me, seem to be the two poles where people inhabit, the two domains, the welfare approach, social housing for everyone, housing benefits for everyone, or let's look at the whole housing system and all the parts of it and let's intervene here to make it a reality. And that's a harder job. But even though it's a harder job, there's lots of people in these regulatory bodies and institutions who agree with us. And what they say is, well, just tell us how to do it. We'd be delighted to introduce the right to housing into economic governance in the union, but nobody has told us how you do it. So that's what I'm saying really is we've a lot of work to do.
Thank you. I think I saw a digital one, by Mike Maguire.
Hi, Padraic. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Mike.
How are you? Sorry, I dialed in Irish time, so I think I've probably missed a significant portion of it. However, it's being recorded, I see. Is that true, Padraic?
Yeah.
Okay, well, look, I look forward to looking back on it then. I'm doing, as Padraic knows, I'm doing a thesis on squatting and adverse possession as part of my master's in the LLM in Galway with Padraic. So yeah, okay. Hello, guys, and nice to see you all, and we'll chat again hopefully sometime.
See you soon, Mike. Okay.
Are there any? Sorry, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, because I know there's a rule that it's 5 o'clock somewhere, but I'm happy to keep going a little bit longer if you want.
Well, we can maybe have one last question, if there is a last question. Everybody's thinking, well, we can also have weekend. No more questions. Okay, well, then I'd like to thank presentation and of course everyone for being here today. Next month on October the 21st we have our next talk series episode during which Mr. Milun Kothari will be our guest speaker. Mr. Kothari served as special rapporteur on adequate housing between 2000 and 2008, so we are very much looking forward to what he has to say. So thank you all for being here and have a wonderful week. Hope to see you again next month.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Padraic.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
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 Bye.